Welcome to the Chapter 19 lecture. In this lecture, we're going to expand on a grammatical concept that was introduced in Chapter 19 on pages 434 to 437, and then they mention it again on page 440. The issue has to do with dependent clauses and phrases and whether or not to use a comma with those clauses and phrases. Now, your book differentiates between clauses that are essential and those that are optional. If those terms make sense to you with all the examples in the book and those in this lecture, you can keep using them. Essential and non-essential or optional are perfectly good terms for these kinds of clauses. But if you feel like it's hard to tell whether information is essential, or if some of the examples seem to you like they're essential but the book says they're optional, then you might understand the following terms better: restrictive and non-restrictive. Those are the terms that I'm going to use in this lecture. Let's take a look at some example sentences. These two sentences are exactly the same, but one of them has commas and the other doesn't. The comma difference also shows up slightly in how we read them aloud. For example, I would read the first sentence as, "The coach who pushed her players too hard was let go." And I would read the second sentence as, "The coach who pushed her players too hard was let go." In the first case, which you might be able to tell from my reading, the phrase here that's highlighted is being used to identify the coach. It tells us which coach we're talking about here. Maybe this story is being told about the history of a basketball program at a high school, or maybe the sentence is found in an opinion piece about high school athletics. Let's say the author wants to keep the coach's name private, so instead the author of the article uses this phrase to identify which coach we're talking about in this case. It tells us which coach out of the several coaches that might appear in the article might be under discussion. Perhaps somewhere else in the article will refer to the coach who was kind and the coach who had favorites or something like that. So each of those phrases identifies which coach we're talking about. In the second sentence, however, the one with the commas, the author is assuming that there is only one coach under discussion, and we all know who she is. Maybe her name has been mentioned already in the writing. Maybe it's someone that the readers or the listeners of this sentence are familiar with. But the information on how she treats her players, the information in this clause, is not necessary to identify her. We're all already familiar with who this person is, even if we don't know her name. We know that she's the one being talked about. Suppose it's an article about one of the players and her difficult season, and one of the things that made it so difficult was that the coach was let go in the middle of the season. So the coach is already known to us in some other way, and it's not because of this information in this phrase. So this is the origin of the term restrictive and non-restrictive. A restrictive phrase or clause is one that restricts all the possible coaches, all the possible people or things we might be talking about. And the phrase or the clause restricts it to the one. Out of all the possible coaches, she's the coach who pushed her players too hard. A non-restrictive phrase doesn't need to restrict because there's only one person or thing we could be talking about. So restricting from a large pool to a smaller single person is not necessary. And the phrase or the clause then instead just gives some other kind of information, something that might be interesting to us, something we might want to know, but it's not identification information. Another way to think about it is if it answers the question, which one, which coach, which sister, which dessert, then it's probably a restrictive or, as your book says, essential phrase. But if there's no need to ask that question, if there's only one thing that we could be talking about, then it's probably a non-restrictive or non-essential phrase, or optional, as your book uses that term. Let's look at a few examples. Here's in the first two pairs of sentences, the restrictive sentence, the sentence with the restrictive clause would be the penguin that fell into the ocean got devoured. Which penguin got devoured? The one that fell into the ocean. So that phrase, that clause, identifies which penguin we're talking about. Feathers McGraw, who is a penguin, disguises himself as a chicken. Do we need to know which Feathers McGraw? Probably not. Because there's probably only one. I can't imagine there being lots and lots of people or things or animals named Feathers McGraw. There's probably just one. We might not know that he's a penguin, so this information tells us that, but it doesn't identify him. His name is plenty to identify him. Here's another example. The players who were arrested were suspended. Which players were suspended? Well, the ones that were arrested. So that information tells us which players the rest of the sentence is talking about. In the non-restrictive sentence, however, we say Andre Smith, who was arrested, was suspended. His name identifies him. The fact that he was arrested is not the thing that tells us who he is. It just tells us something else about him, some additional information, but it doesn't tell us who he is. His name tells us who he is. Occasionally, even with a name, you can have a restrictive sentence. For example, if you know lots and lots of Sarahs, and you're telling someone about Sarah who is pregnant, and they say, oh, you know, is she going to drop out of exercise class? And you say, no, no, no. Or is she going to quit working? And you say, no, 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 it's not the Sarah whom I know from work. She's not pregnant. It's the Sarah whom I go to exercise class with. And so even with the name, we might need an identifying clause. Which Sarah? The one I know from work, or the Sarah I go to exercise class with? Which one? So that restrictive clause tells us which Sarah. But here, if I say Sarah Lott, whom I go to exercise class with, is pregnant, then with the commas, that tells us that this clause is not necessary to identify her. Her name, her full name in this case, identifies her. There's only one Sarah Lott, or only one that I know. Or the reader is just not unclear. They're clear about who that is. And so we don't need an identifying phrase. Now, context does matter with this. In each of these sentences, you can tell by what you see in the sentence, by the words of the sentence, which one it is. But sometimes even the exact same sentence could have a restrictive clause in one case and a non-restrictive clause in another case. So we're going to look at a couple of those. Here's the first one. The dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious, or the dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious. Both of those could be correct depending on the situation. I would say the first situation, the first sentence, would be like if there were a lot of desserts on a table and you went and picked one up and you ate it, and then your friend was like, what dessert should I get? And you say, oh, the dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious. So you're telling which dessert was good. But in the other one, maybe you're describing an entire meal and you tell them about the salad and you tell them about the main dish and then you tell them about the dessert. But there's only one dessert. There's not a whole set of options. So you say, oh, and then the dessert made with fresh raspberries was delicious. So this information tells us something about the dessert, but it doesn't tell us which dessert we're talking about. Here's another situation. My brother Joe knitted himself with a beanie this year. Or my brother Joe knitted himself a beanie this year. Take a minute and think about what would be the two situations where these two sentences would be correct. If you've decided that the first sentence would be correct if you only had one brother, then you're right. The second sentence would be correct if you had more than one brother. Your brother Joe and your brother Michael. And so the word here, Joe, is restrictive. It tells which brother, whereas this word is non-restrictive. You only have one brother. And finally, these last two sentences, the interview subjects who were videotaped answered very conservatively. Or the interview subjects who were videotaped answered very conservatively. In the first sentence, some interview subjects were videotaped and some were not. And the ones that were videotaped answered one way, and presumably the ones who were not videotaped answered another way. In the second sentence, there's only one set of interview subjects. They were all videotaped and they all answered conservatively. This doesn't tell which group answered conservatively. There's only one group under discussion. Hopefully this lecture helps clear up this issue a little bit. If you still have questions, or if you have a specific sentence in mind and you just want to ask me, does this require commas or doesn't it? Is it restrictive or non-restrictive? Please shoot me an email and I'm happy to explain that. Maybe I'll post it in a discussion board for everyone to see.